Welcome everybody to the new edition of Backstory, part of the Bendigo Writers Festival. Coming to you in a unique format this year because it's, as we all know, one of those unprecedented years. I'm Rob Stephenson and I'd like to welcome you all here today. I'd firstly like to acknowledge that wherever we are joining this, we are joining from Indigenous country, and I would like to pay my respects particularly to the people of the land on which I am, Larak, Jajawarong, Kundija, on the land of the Jajawarong people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present of the Jara people who have been the custodians of this land since time immemorial, and also to honour and acknowledge the custodians of all the other places from which we come. I'm joined this evening by Richard Fidler. Some of you will know Richard from the old days, the Doug Anthony All-Stars days, but we're here today to talk about his new book, The Golden Maze. Richard's written about the Prague and the story of Prague from its origins in medieval darkness to its uncertain present. He does what he does so well. He curates an absolutely engaging and compelling history of a place. And he does that by really investigating with curiosity and intelligence the story of the place. And in this book, he takes us through a journey through the life of the city of Prague. So welcome, Richard.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And Richard, you first fell in love, perhaps maybe that's not quite the right words, but I did get the impression from reading The Golden Maze that you have a deep appreciation and passion for Prague. Can you take us back to your first experiences of Prague? You were living and working in London with the Doug Anthony All-Stars in 1989, and the world started to change really quickly. Can you tell us about the Velvet Revolution and your experience?
Yeah, I was living in London, and my group was doing a theatre season at the Bloomsbury Theatre in London. And while I was there, during that was kind of Europe's Year of Miracles, which people might remember, 1989, where one by one all the old police states, the Stalinist police states set up by the Soviet Union in Eastern and Central Europe after the Second World War, they just collapsed under the weight of popular uprisings. First it was Poland, and then Hungary, and then East Germany. And the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989. I'd been to Berlin, and I'd been there when it was divided, and I'd been into the communist half as well as the other half. And I was completely fascinated and longing to be there and longing to witness what was going on. And so as soon as the theatre season finished, I met up with my girlfriend and we went to Berlin, and we had a whole lot of adventures there, which I haven't put in the book because it's not about Prague as such, but we went from there to Prague. And when we arrived in Prague, it was a week after they just inaugurated their new president. This is in the aftermath of their peaceful revolution that they called the Velvet Revolution. And they went from having these dreadful sort of stone cold, cynical apparatchiks. They replaced them with this marvelous man, this man called Václav Havel, who was an internationally successful playwright. He'd been a political prisoner he'd spent years and years in jail. And now he was the newly inaugurated president of this fairy tale magic kingdom. I'd never been to Prague before. I had no Czech language whatsoever. I had about 20, I think, bits of tourist German to speak, and that was about it. I couldn't even book a hotel. I was given advice to book a room at the Grand Hotel Europa on Wenceslas Square. But when I rang, no one spoke English and I spoke no Czech, so I couldn't book a room. So I just showed up. And the whole city was in this kind of delirious, happy turmoil. There was, I sort of liken it to the popping of a champagne cork. That's what it felt like. Suddenly I found myself amongst what appeared to me to be the happiest people in the world who could now see a future again for their lives. And we were staying in this amazing hotel, this beautiful hotel, this Art Nouveau palace with these gilded lines, curly lines. That was just gorgeous. It was, I don't know, built in the 1910s, I think, or thereabouts. And, but it was all run down, very pleasingly so. The carpet was threadbare, the wallpaper was peeling, all of that. And it was incredibly cheap. All the hotel staff were secret police officers. That's how it worked in international hotels. And they were so They were so spectacularly rude. It became a bit of a sport for me and my girlfriend every morning when we go down, and you know, I'd be really cheerful and say, hello, good morning. And then they'd sort of look at me like that. And I used to try and test them just to get a rise out of them. So I went to this woman at the front desk one morning. I said, hello, can you tell me is there somewhere I can make an international phone call from the hotel? And she said, it's completely impossible from this hotel. And then I said, can you advise me anywhere in the city where I can make an international phone call? And she said, you think I spend all my time finding out such things for people like you? Like that. That's how spectacularly rude they were. They were installed there to keep an eye on people, essentially. But everyone else in Prague was lovely and warm and friendly and so kind. The beer was incredibly cheap. People were walking around from place to place. There were demonstrations still taking place because the secret police, even though they'd been officially dismantled, they were still operating, still watching people, still spying on people. So I attended a secret police demonstration. And all this revolutionary joy is taking place in what, for me, struck me as the most beautiful city in the world. Magically beautiful, stunningly beautiful. And as soon as I walked in there, I had this odd, walk through the old town of Prague, I had this odd sense of deja vu. And I think this is common to a lot of people, particularly people like us who grow up in Australia or modern cities. When you go to a place like Prague, it feels oddly familiar, and it takes you a long while to put your finger on it until you realize that Prague is the landscape we have in our imaginations from the folk tales and fairy tales we're told as children. And we walk away from them when we become terribly serious grown-ups. But that landscape still remains in the back of our minds. And suddenly, there you are, to be in a city like Prague, you're immersed in it once more. So this joyous, happy, magical place took hold of me, and I never forgot it.
Yeah, I think it's coming from Australia, my experience in Europe and Prague and Paris probably particularly is that I think you can almost feel the history coming out of the stones as you walk through some of the streets and gaze around at the buildings, and it's often the subtle little bits and pieces. You can see the big gilded angels and all those sorts of things that everybody looks at, but it's often the little bits down between your feet that really tell you the history of the place and the steps that have worn smooth over 500 years. Richard, can you I suppose that was Prague in '89, and what you have talked about really is that the history of the place. In your book goes into some great detail about the long involved history of Prague, which really is how it built to what happened in the Velvet Revolution. I wonder if you can perhaps take us on a bit of a walk through Prague back to maybe when there was a hill with nothing on it, and the first people who came along and thought, this would be a great place to start building our encampment. There's
two ways of telling the origin of Prague, which begins on the hill where Prague Castle is today. That's the hill that is known as Hrdčany. There's the legend of it, and there's what we know from archaeology and documents and coins and the like. The legend is wonderful. The legend says that Prague was founded by a witch princess whose name is Libusha, and it's recorded in this document called the Chronicles of the Bohemians. It was written 1,000 years ago that Libusha stood on the edge of a bluff and looked down at the forest, and she had the gift of prophecy, and she famously said, according to the legend, "I see a great city. Its glory will touch the stars." Then she asked her assistants to go down to the forest below on the other side of the river, and she said, "In a clearing, you will find the man making the best use of his teeth at midday, and that is where we will found our city." And so the courtiers did as they were bid. They went down into the forest, they found a clearing, and there were 3 men building a house. 2 of them were having their lunch, and the third one was still working with a saw, and that was the man making the best use of his teeth. And they asked him what he was building, and he said he was building a threshold for a house. Now, threshold in Czech is Prah, and that's the Czech name for Prague. That's how Prague gets its name. It means threshold. And I see it also as has all this other meaning to it. I think it's a kind of a great threshold of the imagination where all kinds of characters and creatures have been created over the centuries, from the legend of the golem, the monster made out of river mud by the Rabbi Lowe to protect the Jewish quarter. There's the story of the first robot comes from Prague. The idea of the robot was invented by a Czech playwright called Karel Čapek, who came up with the idea of an artificial human that he called robot, because robot is a Czech word for forced labor. And then there's Franz Kafka's famous story, Metamorphosis, where Gregor Samsa wakes up one day transformed giant cockroach. So Prague is this place, I think, where strange creatures of the imagination slide across the threshold into the world. It also gets its name more likely and more prosaically, I have to say, from probably because it was a threshold across the river, the Vltava River, the river that the Germans called the Moldau, on the old one of the old Silk Roads through Central Europe. But that name really suits it. The first settlement is up where Prague Castle is now at Hradčany, where if people have been to Prague, they might remember the St. Vitus Church, with the kind of rocket ship steeples that sit right up on top of the hill, where the president lives now and kings and emperors have lived in the past. And when you walk around there, there's a photo in the book of me from January 1990, and you'll be pleased to notice that I haven't changed a bit. I'm still exactly as good looking as I was back then. Don't look in any way different, which is a wonderful and almost miraculous thing, as keen-eyed people will notice. But that's an amazing point to start if you're going to have a journey through Prague, because you can stand on the balustrade around Prague Castle and look down at the beautiful city below and the Vltava River and the bridges and everything below. And you can wander around the courtyard there and see the mighty cathedral that's there. And as you wander down, you go down this amazing street called Nerudova, which is named after the Czech writer Jan Neruda. And you go down, and all the doors on this street, above the lintel, there's a symbol. Prague is big on symbolism. So there's like a symbol of a lion over one door. There's two suns above another one. There's a crayfish above another one, a swan above another one. And it refers to the name of the person living within, or what they were doing, what their occupation was. You can follow that down, and that leads you into one of the old towns of Prague called Malá Strana, the lower side or lesser side of next to the castle.
Yeah,
that's
I think
very
that's
old too.
When we now think of Prague as being the one city, but I think I think it's really interesting when you do walk around, and as I know you're about to tell us that in fact it's the neighbourhoods, the old towns that now make up what we think of as this one city of Prague have quite a distinctive personality and history that's for a long period of time was actually quite separate.
Yeah, and they were walled off from each other. Like that, it's amazing. Like Prague's quite a small city, but all those different towns within the city, those old medieval towns and ancient and medieval towns, they were all walled off, and you had to pass through gates in order to pass from one part to the other. So if you went down from the castle, you would have passed through a gate to get into Malá Strana, the lower side. That's one of the most gorgeous and historic parts of Prague. And there, it's quite hilly and got all these beautiful winding streets. And this is where often the merchants and the courtiers live. And early on in the life of the city, the Czech king, the Bohemian king, invited German migrants to come and live there, and wealthy German people. So German people have always been a part of Prague, or were a part of Prague up until the end of the Second World War. So you go down through Malá Strana, and that leads you to the Charles Bridge. This is the famous bridge in Prague, and it has two magnificent medieval towers on either end. And as you cross it over the river, this cobblestone bridge that was built in the 14th century, you're flanked on either side by this avenue of statues of saints that were put up in the Habsburg era that sort of look at you as you cross over. It never fails to lift my spirits crossing the Charles Bridge whenever I walk across there, whether it's the middle of summer or even when it's snowing. And then you cross to the far side to the old town. You see a statue there as you cross into the old town of Charles IV, the Holy Roman Emperor who made Prague his capital and turned it into a showcase city. And then you get into really seriously magic Prague in the old town, the winding cobblestone streets. Nothing is at right angles at any point in any part of the old town. And that leads you eventually into the old town square, which is a magical place, incredibly beautiful place. And there's the old town hall there, and this astronomical clock, this famous clock with these whirling dials that tell time in Prague, that map ancient Babylonian time as well. And it's got a sun dial on it to show, a disc on it to show the rising and setting sun. and it's got an astrological calendar down below. It's completely amazing. And there's a wonderful legend, which is completely false, but nonetheless a fun legend, that the clockmaker had made the clock so beautiful that the council burnt his eyes out, so he could not make another one as beautiful anywhere else in the world. And so that takes you into the old town of and the winding streets of Prague. I called the book The Golden Maze because when you walk through there in the middle of the night, like around about 1 a.m., when there's no one around and all the tourists have gone, the streets are lit with this golden hue. It's really quite magical, and you can feel yourself losing yourself in those winding tangle of streets there. In the old town square, there's just near that clock, there are like little crosses on the cobblestones, and that indicates that they're there to represent the bodies of martyrs who were beheaded, Protestant martyrs who were beheaded in the old town square in the early 1600s after the Battle of White Mountain. And this is a really important date. So, and there's bullet marks from Nazi machine guns when one of the last battles of the Second World War in Europe was played out in Prague as well. So everywhere you go in this part of Prague, you just see so much history and evidence of history. And right in the middle of the old town square, there's this big monument, a huge wedding cake monument to Jan Hus, who was the great reformer of the 14th, 15th century, who wanted to reform the Catholic Church. He deplored its sale of indulgences. He thought the clergy were too rich, and for his trouble, he was burnt alive at the stake. So he's remembered as someone who was willing to speak truth to power. That's a big deal for the Czech people. His slogan is "Truth prevails," and that might sound triumphant. Truth will prevail, but it doesn't necessarily always have that tone. It's almost like you hope truth will prevail, or truth should prevail. That's the national motto of the country now.
And it's certainly been a long struggle there, and the process by which truth has prevailed has certainly not been an easy and a direct one through most of that history that you're talking about. And I think around that area as well, there's some fantastic, over the top restaurants. Maybe the restaurants aren't that great, but when you sit in them, some of the glorious Art Nouveau and strange Cubist building certainly speaks to a really glorious time in the early 20th century as well, around that the old town area. And
the food, Czech food. I have to admit, I'm a bit of a sucker for a Bunnings sausage sizzle. So Prague food to me is kind of like heaven in some ways. It's those kind of really delicious Czech sausage with good cheap beer, sauerkraut, goulash. Yeah, it's a meat eater's paradise.
Yeah, the pork knuckle and the sauerkraut in the old town square is pretty good with a great big beer.
Mm-hmm.
So the town square. So we've talked about three of the towns that make up Prague. Take us on the rest.
There you go. If you're walking out of the old town square, you can go up a little street called Paryška, which is Paris Street, which leads you into the old Jewish quarter of Prague, which is the most haunted part of Prague, I have to say. I mean, emotionally haunted. I mean, there's ghosts everywhere, but it almost feels that way. It's airless and incredibly sad. Most of the old Jewish ghetto that was in Prague, this tiny little tangle of streets that was walled in, was torn down in the 19th century because it was it had become a slum, and new fashionable houses were built there. So funnily enough, the old Jewish quarter, which was once a rough slum in Prague in the 19th century, is now the richest part of Prague, where all these handsome Parisian apartments are, and international brands, your Gucci's and your Pradas are all along there in Prague today. But if you take a little side street just around the corner from down one of the lanes off that street, it takes you still into the remnant of the old medieval Jewish quarter, the old synagogues and the Jewish cemetery, which is a remarkable place. It's this kind of broken sort of rectangle, and it's highly compressed. And the headstones sort of poke out at all sorts of different angles, like sort of broken teeth out of the ground. There was a law that was in place throughout the Middle Ages, which was that the cemetery couldn't be enlarged because the Jewish quarter itself was so small. So what they would do is once they filled up the cemetery with headstones, they then fill it in and then another layer on top, and then another, and then another layer. It's thought that the layers of headstones run 12 deep in the Jewish cemetery in the Old Town Square. Prague suffered in the Second World War under Nazi occupation. The Czech people were pretty well sold out by Britain and France, and their country was left to the mercy of Adolf Hitler, who invaded, took the Sudetenland in 1938 and then invaded the whole country in 1939. It was one of the preludes to the Second World War. And the first time I went to Prague, I was wondering, why is it and how is it that the synagogues and the Jewish cemetery is still standing, even though the Nazis occupied the place for some 6 years? And now I know the reason is because the Nazis wanted to turn that Jewish quarter into an open-air museum of a dead race. That was their plan for it, to make it this kind of nightmarish monument to the extinct Jewish people. And the dreadful thing is, he was almost entirely successful. Nearly, I think only out of the thousands and thousands of Jewish people living in Prague and in Bohemia at large, only about 460 survived the Second World War. So today it has this awful, airless, haunted quality to it, this great, profound sense of catastrophe and tragedy to the place, that you feel it straight away. You can't help but notice it. It's a very, very powerful experience. This place that was once so vibrant, it was once a great center of Jewish scholarship throughout the world. Well, there's hardly any Jewish people living there anymore. It attempts to have a bit of a revival. I think there's a Jewish restaurant there now, and services I think are still held in the synagogue. But it's a monument to the tragedy of 20th century Europe. That's the Jewish quarter there. It's a completely fascinating place.
It's I think that whole, the story of, well, Czechoslovakia, as it was for a reasonable part of the 20th century, as it comes through in your book, we think that with the current COVID hardships we're going through, that it's, life's tough, but really we've got no idea, and we've been incredibly blessed, I think, both to live in Australia, and also probably for the last couple of generations, we've had an incredibly blessed life in terms of what we actually think of as hardship, and you're highlighting the journey of Prague through the 20th century particularly is quite real, and I think because when you compare to what was happening there in 1968 to what we were doing in 1968, or between 68 and 89, I think, because those periods are within our collective memories, I think it really brings home the picture that things are not always in the rest of the world like we think they are in Australia, or our conception of what's going on, and hardships and all those sorts of things are quite wrong. Certainly when I went to school, Czechoslovakia was somewhere that was behind the Iron Curtain, so really wasn't anything that we learnt about. But of course, that was a long time ago when I went to school. So
I think the thing about Prague is, as a city, it's right pretty much smack bang in the heart of Europe, and it's a natural meeting place for different peoples as they're passing through Europe or settling in nearby. The three main peoples of Bohemia were of course the Czechs, the Western Slavs, the Czechs, the Bohemian Germans who lived there in many towns and in Prague, who spoke German pretty much the whole time. I went to German schools, and the Jewish people. But you also had people like from Slovakia, Slovak people coming through, Polish people, Hungarians, and the like, and many Italian architects came up to build the palaces. The Baroque splendor of Prague was largely built by the Italian community that came to live and stay there. And there's the Roma people that were themselves almost entirely murdered during the Holocaust as well. This has meant that there's episodes in Prague's history where the culture and life and science suddenly become incredibly rich. During the reign of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, this very strange, in fact, I'd have to say, completely weird emperor who was living in Prague Castle in the late 1500s, early 1600s. He was an incredibly curious man, and so Prague became a place that attracted great scientists, astronomers, as well as astrologers, magicians like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth I's personal magician. It attracted the scientists Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler. Johannes Kepler came to Prague, and that's where he decoded the secret of planetary motion while he was staying in Prague. During this time as well, you had alchemists, because alchemy was considered a kind of a science, the precursor to chemistry, whereby you had people working in Prague Castle on behalf of Emperor Rudolf, trying to create the philosopher's stone that would transmute base matter into gold, because Rudolf was always in need of gold for his adventures and for the stuff he was collecting. And Rudolf himself kept this extraordinary chamber of curiosities in Prague Castle, his Kunstkammer, as it was called, where he had his most precious items were a unicorn's horn, which was probably just like the horn of a narwhal, probably, but he thought it was a unicorn's horn, and a chalice, a golden chalice that he thought was the Holy Grail that had caught Christ's blood as it spilt from the cross. And he had all sorts of like mechanical little peacocks. He had a tiny miniature piano made out of glass there. He also kept this incredible menagerie of pets in Prague Castle. He had lions in Prague Castle. He had tigers. He had a cassowary from New Guinea, a remarkable thing to procure in the 16th century, I think. And he had a dodo from Mauritius. And his favorite of these animals was a lion that was a gift to the Ottoman Sultan to him, which he named Muhammad. And Muhammad pretty much had the run of Prague Castle. So can you imagine being like a servant in Prague Castle, and there's this lion called Muhammad just sort of padding around wherever he feels like. And Rudolf, being Rudolf, never had quite enough money to feed Muhammad properly. So every once in a while they found some poor servant that had been, mauled by Muhammad or even killed by him. So all this madness is going on in Prague, and all this, Rudolf was one of those emperors who thought that the whole universe was like this beautiful, complex contraption, and with these hidden connections between things. And God had created that, but God had also given us reason to figure out how the whole thing worked. So that was the kind of the joy of being a scientist or a scholar in a place like Prague at the time. So you have this idea of Prague as this meeting place between all these different peoples, all these different ideas are exchanged while people are there. But then in the 20th century, it becomes the plaything for two of the worst monsters in history. First Adolf Hitler, and then Joseph Stalin. Both of them imposed terrible, monstrous tyrannies on Prague. Parts of the huge sections of the population were murdered under orders from these people, and it still has both those tyrannies have left their scars on Prague even today.
So let's without going too much into the detail of those horrific times, probably the ones that really stick in the imagination because they are in our history is maybe Prague Spring in 1968, which did get the world excited. 68 was a huge year, and in so many cities it looked like the world was going to change for the better in so many places, and in some it did, in others it didn't. Can you perhaps talk to us a little bit about 1968? I think the other thing that you reflected on all the scientists and everybody who has flocked to Prague over the centuries, the university and the role of students perhaps in what happened in the 20th century, and as that perhaps led to 89 as well.
Sure. Throughout, when the Stalinist regime, there was a communist coup d'etat in 1948, and immediately there was the Stalinist terror. People were arrested in the middle of the night. There were mass executions, Stalinist show trials. Completely innocent people were accused of being traitors working as part of a British Zionist American CIA conspiracy, blah, 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 blah. And there were many show trials, and senior figures in the party were even pulled out at Stalin's behest and executed in the prison, which left a kind of a terrible freezing of society at the time, as people became quite frightened of the party. And they were sort of becoming trained to agree with what the party said, no matter what the party said. 2 + 2 = 5. Black is white, up is down. It was, very 1984, like George Orwell's 1984. Then as the 60s rolled on, there was a thaw in this frozen state of society in Prague. Filmmakers started to make these really compelling and interesting films that was known as the Czech New Wave. Rock and roll came to Prague. It sort of started to sneak around in through the edges, just on the outside. And there was a hardliner in charge of the party, and therefore in charge of the country, called Novotny, who was overthrown in a party coup and replaced by a younger man named Alexander Dubček. Now, when Dubček took power in January 1968, I think a lot of people went, oh yeah, so what, another apparatchik replaced another one. But Dubček quickly revealed himself to be a very different kind of creature. He wasn't one of these kind of bull-headed Stalinist thugs. He was young, he had sort of slick back hair, beak-like nose, he had gentle eyes, he was quite charismatic and had a lovely warm smile. He was genuinely affable. And he talked about delivering something that he called socialism with a human face. He wanted to liberalize the communist system, open up greater freedom of speech, make it possible for people to travel overseas again, to have freedom of association, have organizations in society that weren't controlled by the Communist Party. And he made great strides. And suddenly there was this enormous surge of energy in Prague. Nightclubs open, people going out and dancing. There's music, jazz and rock and roll. There's people writing newspapers, people writing extraordinary things in the newspapers. They were wanting to account for the crimes of the Stalinist era. And meanwhile, the Soviet Union was watching all this under Leonid Brezhnev, going, this can't be allowed to go on. Brezhnev told this to Dubček several times, but Dubček at this point was a really popular figure. And he was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place. If he'd gone back on his reforms at Brezhnev's insistence, it would have destroyed his popularity within his own country. And he just bet that they wouldn't do anything, that they wouldn't intervene, so long as he kept part of their defense coalition called the Warsaw Pact. And he was warned. And on August 21st, 1968, my friend and colleague Jaroslav Kovačič was a young man living in Prague at that point. Jaroslav remembers that night staying up late, drinking in a pub, walking across the Legion Bridge to his apartment. And he heard buzzing in the sky up above, but it was a cloudy night. He couldn't quite see what it was. Went home to bed and was woken by the phone ringing 3 hours later. It was about 3 a.m. Someone said, "We are occupied. We've been invaded." The Soviet Union and its allies invaded Czechoslovakia and sent tanks into Prague. In mid-morning, there were tanks in Wenceslas Square. And this was a ghastly spectacle to a lot of Praguers because they'd seen a similar spectacle in 1939 when Adolf Hitler's tanks were in the middle of Wenceslas Square in Prague. And here we are 30 years later, and it's just under a different flag. So people got out of their beds in the pre-dawn darkness. They went to defend the radio building, which was still broadcasting messages of resistance. They turned over a tram and several cars to create a barricade, which they set on fire to stop the tanks getting to the radio building. Jaroslav told me he was in the Wenceslas Square, and they were shouting at the tanks and the tank troops, who were frightened and weirded out because they'd all been told they were going to liberate Prague. They were going to be greeted as liberators, freeing the city from counter-revolutionaries. And here is this whole city screaming and shouting at them and calling them fascists. And they panicked. Some of the tank commanders panicked, fired into the crowd, mowed down a whole bunch of people. Then they sort of fell back to the radio building, and the tanks just ran over the top of that and opened fire again on the crowd. Today, there's a plaque on the side of the radio building there for people who died on that day trying to defend the radio building. And it all went haywire. The coup came off the rails pretty quickly. They were expecting their own stooges to take over from Dubček, but it didn't quite pan out that way. But they broke Alexander Dubček. They flew him to Moscow, broke him, and he agreed to a process that he called normalization. Normalization meant end of freedom of speech, end of freedom of travel. Dubček was cast aside, and you entered this dark, gloomy period from 1969 all the way up to the Velvet Revolution. And this is a period when Václav Havel came to the fore, the playwright. His plays had already been shown in New York. He had an international reputation. And he wrote some brilliant essays and formed an organization called Charter 77 to protest the communist regime. But as you say, the role of students was really important because in 1969, there was this tragic event. There was a a young student, a young man named Jan Palach, who was infuriated by what he thought was the apathy of his fellow citizens about the Soviet invasion. So to protest it, he went to the top of Wenceslas Square in January 1969 with 2 buckets of petrol, poured them on his head and set fire to himself. He survived for another 3 days and called himself Torch Number 1 and asked people to follow his example. And several other young men tragically did this. And today, that was never forgotten. That wasn't forgotten. His funeral was attended by something like 500,000 people. And the funeral is this terribly sad moment when people were saying goodbye to their hopes of the Prague Spring. So all this lay dormant. The society lay almost totally dormant for decades until the late 1980s. That's when things started to move into gear again. And once again, it was the next generation of students that kickstarted the Velvet Revolution by a demonstration they held in the middle of the city that was where they were attacked by riot police. That was the final straw for the regime. And this was the beginning of an incredibly intense 2-week period where the communist regime was overthrown, led by Václav Havel. But the students were at the forefront. The students instigated it. Their parents had given up hope. But somehow, having grown up in a morally contaminated environment, these young people in Prague, who were kind of my age at the time, so I profoundly identify with them, they found the moral courage and the dignity to stand up against it, and they succeeded.
Yeah, and I think they're probably not the most appropriate, seeing it was the end of the Russians, but Lenin probably said some of that really well, and he said that there are decades when nothing happens and weeks where decades happen, and,
yes,
and
that's
reading
very true.
the day by day, I think, blow of that the big week or couple of weeks in 1989 just really is incredible, the amount of change that happened in such an incredibly short period of time after 20 years of really not much at all. And
yeah. Yes, there was a journalist at the time who Timothy Garton Ash, who arrived in Prague just as the revolution was starting to unroll in Prague, and he said in Poland it took 10 years, in Hungary it took 10 months. In East Germany, it took 10 weeks. Perhaps in Prague, it'll take 10 days. And Havel went, yes, yes. And that was the slogan they ran. And he grabbed that at once and used that as the kind of motivating slogan that we'll have our Velvet Revolution in 10 days.
Yeah, no, an incredible period. In the discussion about the book, Richard, your publisher talks about the uncertain future. I think that's a biography of necessity can only bring us up through the life of a place or a person until now, and however interesting that is, the future remains somewhat unknown. Prague's, there's a lonely planet to Prague, and everybody goes there, and when I was there a couple of years ago, it was certainly incredibly busy at the height of the tourist season. What's the future of Prague, seeing as it's had such a tumultuous past? How do you see that?
I think it'll always be an interesting, vibrant place that will, if the European Union holds, it's going to be great. Whether that holds, nothing lasts forever, but in the European Union, it sits right in the heart of geographically of Europe, and temperamentally so too, I think, in many ways. Unfortunately, a lot of those nations around it have gone bad. Poland and Hungary in particular have sort of slid into majoritarian autocracies. Once again, liberal democracy was so hard won by those people. A great many people in both those countries have lost interest in that. And so now they have authoritarian regimes in Budapest and in Warsaw who are not really interested in hearing much back chat from the press, the media, or the judiciary. There are, I think, forces at work in Prague that would like to see the country go the same way. The Czech Republic, that is. Certainly the current president's a controversial figure. He's seen by a great many to be too close to Russia and China, so much so that a few years back, a group of art terrorists broke into Prague Castle while Zeman was president, well, the current president. They disguised themselves as chimney sweeps, managed to climb onto the roof of Prague Castle, pull down the presidential flag, and replace it with a pair of gigantic red silk underpants. Now, this is very much in the Czech tradition of prank. The Czechs have got this long history of political pranks. And this is absolutely right up there. And afterwards, very amusingly, they took an ISIS-style photograph of themselves with balaclavas on, holding up the red underpants. They said this was a symbol of shamelessness for a president who shows no shame. The current prime minister is an interesting guy, Andrej Babiš. He is the second richest man in the country. He controls a gigantic agricultural firm. Personally owns a large part of the country's media, and is alleged to have been an informant for the secret police under the old communist regime. Nonetheless, while I was there for the 50th anniversary of the self-immolation of Jan Palach, that young man who set fire to himself in Wenceslas Square. That was last year. And I went to a giant rally in the middle of Wenceslas Square, which packed out the whole of the square, where the president wasn't there, the prime minister wasn't there. People had gathered to protest against the creeping assault, the creeping weakening of democracy in the Czech Republic. I think it's going to be different there from Poland and Hungary. The tragedy of Poland and Hungary is a lot of their most talented young people have left. They're gone to go and make money in Germany or Britain or elsewhere in the world. But Prague's talented young people have by and large stayed, and they're ready. They want to fight for their democracy. They want to fight hard for it. And there's a group called 1,000,000 Moments for Democracy, which has been instituted to campaign for this and to keep a watching brief on creeping authoritarianism in their country. And they hold mass rallies all the time. That's a really heartening sign. The other thing about the country is that Paul Wilson, who was a member of the dissident band, the Plastic People of the Universe in Prague, he said that the Czechs have standing informal association. Like, everyone belongs to these informal groups, you know, a mother's club, a dog walkers club, you know, fans of the same band, or they play in a folk music band together, or they do something else together. They have all these really good civic society there where people band together and show up for stuff together, and it's all informal. And he says this is a sign of good civic health. I often look at Australia like that too. I think Australia still has a lot of those good organisations. This is stopping us, I think, holding us back from going down the American route at the moment. I think we sort of tend to look out for each other a bit better than Americans do.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks for having me.